Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar on seeing identity and access management through risk-colored glasses. My name is Nele, I'm product marketeer at Elimity. Elimity is a Belgian software company that offers identity intelligence solutions. But I'm not here to talk about Elimity today, so let's dive right in. Identity and access management has gone through a lot of transformations over the years, but recently it has transformed from a more compliance-driven market to become a more risk-aware, risk-driven market today. And according to me, that's quite a healthy change. Not because compliance or efficiency, for that matter, aren't valid views on identity and access management, but because a risk-driven approach, a risk-driven view enables you and everyone in your organization to look at identity and access management in a holistic way, to make sure you're not missing anything, that there are no gaps in your strategy, and that you can be confident about the priorities that you set, that they make sense for your organization. And even though 85% of the organization wants to become more risk-aware, risk-driven, only 45% of those organizations actually implemented such a risk-driven approach to identity and access management. And the reason is simply because they miss a hands-on approach, they miss those practical tips, the right tools to do this efficiently and effectively. And that's what I will try to do today, to help you indeed with those practical tips so that you can get started. Well, within identity and access management, there are several risk factors that could pose significant threats to your organization. And we gathered the risk factors, let's say, that we see in practice with those that are identified by frameworks such as ISO 27001 and SOC 2. And we combined them in what you can see as the identity wheel. It consists out of 9 building blocks. I will go over them briefly, but it's important to remember that the goal of a risk-driven approach is not to eliminate all of those risks, because that's just not realistic. It will happen, there will be risks, but it's important to know the risks so that you can indeed manage them properly. First, we have the orphaned accounts. Orphaned accounts can be defined as accounts that belong to an inactive, an invalid, or even no user at all. Typical examples are dormant accounts, inactive accounts, ghost accounts, or accounts that are expired. And you can imagine these type of accounts as doors to your house that you no longer need, no longer use. So it's better and safer to remove those doors and put up a wall. I don't think I have to explain that more. Secondly, there are the privileged accounts. They can be defined as accounts that have sensitive or just a lot of access rights. Typically that are admin accounts or just accounts with a lot of roles. The exact definition of such a privileged account is quite business specific. We will get more into detail about it later, but it depends on the sector and the systems that you use, entitlements within that system that indeed are sensitive, quite business specific. Third, there is access accumulation. This occurs when users have more access rights than they strictly need to do their job. And that could result in the fact that employees could misuse those rights that they actually don't need. Or if the accounts get hacked, more damage can be done than if they wouldn't have had those additional access rights. Fourth, identity hygiene, or better, bad identity hygiene or clutter. Well, these are just all the things that make identity and access management less manageable. Things you don't need anymore, like empty groups or empty roles, unassigned groups, and so on. Fifth, there are the access controls. Now you can see that it's a two-part risk. First of all, it's about accounts that do a lot of suspicious things, like, for example, failing to log in for multiple times in a row. And on the other hand, it's about, let's say, well, access controls that aren't up to date anymore, like, for example, passwords that are expired. Secondly, we have data quality, or again, bad data quality. Incomplete or inaccurate information or data can result in a lot of mistakes because processes use that data to, for example, create an account, and those mistakes could indeed result in risks, in threats to your organization. Seventh, there is role model if the role model isn't properly designed or isn't properly maintained, it could structurally assign more access rights to employees than they certainly need to do their job. So basically, that results in access accumulation. 8 is segregation of duties, and I don't think I have to explain to you that if an employee has the entitlements to perform conflicting transactions, such as submitting and approving an invoice, that could pose a risk, and more specifically, a fraud risk. And then last but definitely not least, business-specific policies or internal policies where users indeed do not follow or violate certain internal policies that could pose a risk that is not necessarily related to cyber attack, but related to fines, for example. So the type of risk can vary. Now, across that identity wheel, we can distinguish 3 groups. The first is indeed from 1 to 6. The second group is basically just the role model, and then the third group is SOD and internal policies. Now, we make this distinction because the practical approach, the practical tips are slightly different for each of those. And I said that you needed hands-on approach, not just a general approach, but a general approach can help you to create structure, and it will also help me to create structure during this webinar. So that's why we introduce these steps. First, it's of course important to understand the situation, then indeed act so that you can improve the situation, and thirdly, make sure that what you did is sustained, that you don't go back to the way it was before, and that you can even identify other areas that you can improve, and then the cycle starts again. So let's look at the first group of risk factors, which we call IAM KRIs, key risk indicators. And just to remind you, that was about these 6 factors. The first thing was to understand the current situation. And to do that, it's important to define the different indicators within each risk factor. Determine what they mean for your organization. For example, unused accounts could be defined as accounts for which the user hasn't logged in for the last 90 days. Now, maybe you would prefer 30 days, or you would like to make a distinction between the type of account. For example, privileged accounts, well, you would want to know after 30 days. For non-privileged accounts, it could, for example, be 90 days. Of course, then you have to define what a privileged account means for your organization, and so on. So defining that is fundamental. So it's important to involve the right people there, the people that know the system, that know the entitlements, that know which entitlements are privileged and which are not, for example, to really get those definitions right. Of course, once you have those definitions right, you still do not really understand your current situation. So it's important to measure those indicators. And this is often where it gets difficult, where things get stuck. Why? Because indicators often span across multiple applications. You can already see it here in this example, where users haven't logged in, let's say, in Active Directory, but the inactive status in the HR system is in Workday or in SAP HR. And trying to measure this manually with homegrown spreadsheets, let's say, is difficult, will overcomplicate the process, and will most likely frustrate employees, and could thus, as a result, paralyze your entire attempt of being risk-driven. So I would really suggest to look for the right technology that can help you to automate this, so that you have the results without the frustration. And then you have the results, but then it's important to evaluate how important certain risk indicators are for your organization to do something about it. And you have just the numbers, but you want indeed the risk levels as you see them here, to see indeed how crucial is it for me to act on them. And typically, a risk heat map comes into play, where the risk level is determined by the product of the likelihood of the risk materializing and the impact that will have on your organization. So the worse the impact and the more likely it will occur, the higher the risk level will be. Now, even that sometimes is not really that easy. So another thing that we suggest you could do is to look at two things. The first thing is the number of results, so the number of findings, and the inherent risk that is related to a single finding, a single result. Let me explain. If you have one non-privileged orphan account, the risk could be low. If you have 1,000 non-privileged orphan accounts, the risk is most likely high. But if you have 10 privileged orphan accounts, the risk could also be high. So here in this example that I used, it depends on the number of results and on whether it's privileged or non-privileged orphan account. Now, once you have put risk levels on the different risk factors, they will help you to prioritize in the next phase to indeed help you focus on what to do next. And focus is key in a risk-based approach, because trying to clean up everything will again overcomplicate the process and, well, paralyze your attempt to be risk-driven. Now, besides risk level, I know that also efficiency and compliance can influence this decision, but risk should definitely be fundamental. Now, suppose that you have decided that, okay, orphan accounts is really critical, I will focus on cleaning up orphan accounts. Now, within those, let's say, thousands of orphan accounts that you have, or unused accounts even, if you want to go a little bit lower than just orphan accounts. Or which of those 1,000 orphan accounts will I have to clean up first? Well, that's where the risk effort matrix can come in handy. Well, it's best, again, to focus on those orphan accounts that bring you the highest risk, but the effort to clean them up is the lowest. And if you make a prioritization within your cleanup project based on this matrix, you will most likely get a graph that looks like this. In the beginning, if you focus on those with the highest risk and the lowest effort, your risk will indeed drop, and after a while it will, the decline will be slower and slower. As I already said in the beginning, a risk-based approach does not have as an objective to eliminate all risks, because, that's first of all realistic and will take, as you see, a lot of time and effort, while there are still other factors that you need to address as well. So that's why setting a project goal for each project can really help to determine the scope of the project. A first type of project goal is based on the risk. So if you want to make sure that the risk is reduced to a certain level, that can be a project goal based on the risk appetite of the company. Another type of project goal could be based on the time. Let's say, okay, I want to clean up orphan accounts for the next 2 months. Then this is a type of project goal that you see. And then it's really important to focus on those accounts, clean those accounts up first that have the greatest, the highest risk. Now, if you are, once you have cleaned up a certain set of orphan accounts, it's important to make sure that what you cleaned up will not just come back, and that's what we see here. So detect indeed when something comes back. And how do we do that? By preferably automated and continuous monitoring and reporting. And it has 3 purposes. The first is to track progress during the project. So still when you're indeed working on the project, so that you can follow up if everything is going according to plan. Maybe there's a certain department where the orphan accounts are not cleaned up very properly, so that you can can tell them to put a little more effort in, for example. The second thing is to avoid backsliding. So indeed, orphan accounts will come back. If you sit back and relax, they will come back and they will start piling up again. So make sure that you can detect them and take immediate action if necessary, before indeed you have that whole pile of orphan accounts again. And the third thing is to monitor accepted risks. As I said, for example, privileged accounts, you will definitely have privileged accounts. You cannot operate without privileged accounts, but it's important to follow up trends and detect, for example, when there's a sudden spike in privileged accounts that's not normal, that you can detect it immediately and take action before things get out of hand. The second group of risk factors, or actually risk factor, is the role model. When we think about risks related to the role model, there are two situations to consider. The first is where there is already a role model, but it's not up to date anymore. This could result in, as I already said, structurally assigning too much access rights to your employees. The second situation is when there's no role model yet, and in that situation, well, there's not a lot of structure in assigning access rights to employees, and that could also result in too much access rights because it's about copy-pasting accounts and so on. So it's not really structurally assigning access rights at all. But first, again, understanding the situation. So in the first situation where there is a role model, it's important to determine whether it's still up to date, whether it's still effective for your organization or not. And according to us, there are two measures that are really important to help you define that. And the first is to do a to be as is comparison, or in other words, a SOL-ist comparison, where you map indeed the ideal situation where you would follow the role model and compare it to the situation it is now. Which access rights do people have at this point. And that could be visualized as can be seen here on that slide, where the green indicates someone has a certain entitlement, certain privilege, and he should have that according to the role model, according to the blueprint. Red indicates he has an entitlement, he has a privilege that he shouldn't have according to the role model, and the orange is the opposite. Someone does not have that entitlement, that privilege, but he should have that according to the role model. Well, we can distract or subtract a mapping score from that, which well, actually basically is all the green ones, so all the correct assignments compared to the total, so the total green, red, and orange. And that could give a percentage per application for the entire role model across all applications. So that depends on how you want to scope that SOL-ist or to be as is comparison. The second important measure is group homogeneity, where you're going to look at a group of people that are assigned the same role and see how similar they are in terms of access rights. As you see an example, you see that if we do this for HR employees, let's say, it would be 53%, which will indicate that we probably will have to make this more fine-grained, to, for example, add location as it is below, like HR employees in Brussels. Maybe then the similarity score will go up. Now, taking those results together from the to be as is comparison and the group homogeneity, you could get a score on what we call the role fitness continuum. Again, that role fitness continuum, you could have that for your entire role model, or you could make separate for each of your applications, for groups of applications. So that depends on how you see the different applications. And you see that there can be a perfect fit, or it can be totally unsuited. Like, perfect fit is that the to be as is comparison perfectly matches, and unsuited would be the opposite. There is not one green square to see. Well, both of those situations are very, very unlikely. It will most likely be somewhere in between. In the second situation, where there is no role model yet, it's important to to decide on how important it is to have that role model. You can look at risk, at compliance, or at efficiency on how to, see how important it would be. And most likely it will be beneficial for your organization in terms of risk. It would help you to bring more structure, and if you trust the role model, so if it's let's say the perfect combination between, or the perfect trade-off between usability and security, it could help you to ensure and enforce least privileged. However, even though it might be beneficial, the most important question is how important is it? Is it more important than cleaning up orphan accounts, or is it not? And that depends on the situation of your IAM KRI. So what's the risk level for your orphan accounts, let's say. Secondly, you have to decide on what to do. Again, the role model fitness continuum you see here, and as I said, both extremes are very unlikely. Now, if you're more to the right, so your role model is quite effective, so it's not totally not up to date, then incremental changes will be fine. And then it will be around role extension, role cleansing, creating a new role, deleting a role that's not being used anymore, or changing an existing role. For example, if there's a certain role with certain entitlements that indeed come with that role, but you see based on logs that one entitlement is not being used anymore, then it's safer to get that entitlement out of that role to still ensure this privilege. If you're more to the left of the continuum, then a redesign of a part of the role model might be better. And I say part of the role model because, again, focus is key. You can focus on those applications which are most critical, which are more sensitive, or indeed for which the mapping score was very low, and start with redesigning that part. You do not have to start redesigning the whole role model at once. Now, I'm not going into detail about how we look at designing a role model and how to do that automatically, even though it's quite interesting, it would lead us too far. But let me say one thing: combine the right technology with the right people to do this efficiently and effectively. And another thing to mention is that it's not 50% is not the cutoff between incremental changes and between redesigning. No, that's kind of like a gray zone, and it depends also on how you as an organization look at these things. Now, once you have or designed a part of a role model, have cleaned up your role model, it's important to maintain that role model again. Otherwise, you just have to every couple of years start with these projects again. It's better to just maintain it and take immediate action when something pops up, because indeed businesses are dynamic, and you don't need a static role model because it's not going to work. You need a dynamic role model as well. And to enable that, there are two things that you can do. The first thing is monitoring and reporting. Again, during the cleanup, you can track progress, but afterwards you can indeed monitor the role model effectiveness and identify areas for improvement. Now, the key performance indicators or the key risk indicators, however you want to call it, you can follow up, are the ones you saw in the identify phase. It could be a solid comparison, so a mapping score, it could be group homogeneity score, it could be overlapping roles, but it could, for example, also be the number of roles compared to the number of employees. If that gets too high, it's indeed a sign that you have too many roles and it will get unmanageable. In practice, we also see, for example, that organizations want to ensure a minimum mapping score for certain, mapping score for the role model for certain applications. And as you see here in the example, there is a distinction between, for example, Active Directory and Temenos, so you can make a distinction in the minimum mapping score you are working towards based on, again, criticality, sensitivity of those applications. But that's a good point, a good objective to work towards. The other thing to help you maintain an effective role model is to have role recommendations, and preferably automated role recommendations, so that your role model is kept up to date automatically through the role model lifecycle. The third group of risk indicators are segregation of duties and internal policies. In this webinar, I'm going to focus mainly on the segregation of duties. Developing and implementing segregation of duties is considered very difficult and time-consuming. And I'm not going to say that it's all of a sudden going to be very easy, but applying a risk-based approach to segregation of duties will make it more manageable. Because focusing on low-risk areas with very detailed SOD rules will make the process a lot more cumbersome than it has to be. First, again, understand the current situation. Now, to understand the current situation, of course, we need to know what the combinations of transactions are that you do not want to occur. So there's those toxic pairs. To help you start with defining those, it can help to look at the key business processes, because if there are certain transactions there that you would not want to occur, they probably are going to be important because it's your key business process. Now, I'm not going into detail about the business definition of the transactions and the technical definition that translates indeed to entitlements. But once you have identified the different or the most important, let's say, transactions, combination of transactions, put a risk score on them again. So if such a combination occurs and if it is misused by an employee, what would be the impact on the organization, or not by the employee, maybe by a hacker? What would be the impact on the organization? So here you can again use the risk heat map, so likelihood times the impact. And then it's a matter of focusing. I know I said it before, but focus is key. And you could work based on a threshold. For example, focus for the next step, for the next project, on all those transactions with a high risk. With a high risk score. And then it's important to evaluate the current situation, which of those combinations actually occur in practice. And you could visualize this in this kind of, visual to easily see that, where you see on the left and on the top of the matrix, the different entitlements that could not occur together, the different entitlements of the scope. And red with a cross indicates, okay, this is a combination of entitlements that is not allowed, but it happens in practice. Green with a cross indicates this combination of entitlements, it's not allowed, but it doesn't happen in practice, so that's fine. And the orange one are combinations of entitlements that occur in practice, but we don't know whether they are allowed or not. But we come back to that later in phase 3. Now, it's important to focus on those violations that are actually present, putting in preventative controls for those violations, for those for those combination of transactions that are not occurring at this moment is not indeed the most efficient thing to do. So focus on those violations that occur in practice. Then indeed something has to be done. There are mainly two things you can do. The first is to mitigate. That is that you are going to accept that the conflict exists, but put controls into place to lower the risk. And that can be preventative controls or can be detective controls. Preventative, for example, approval. If you want to do something that costs more than 500 euros, you need additional approval. Something like that. A second thing is to remediate, where you are permanently going to correct the conflict. The options you have there are a tactical cleanup, for example, revoking an entitlement that creates the conflict violation, revoking an entire role, maybe deleting an entire account, or it could be a strategic redesign. If the conflict, if the conflict is incorporated in your role model, meaning that those two entitlements that are not allowed to go together are indeed within one single role, then you're structurally assigning those conflicts to people, then you should redesign that part of the role model. And then third, again, you want to maintain a situation. Once you have cleaned up or handled the segregation of duties, you want to maintain that situation. And monitoring and reporting are, again, the thing to do that. There are 4 reasons why monitoring and reporting is important. First of all, to track progress during indeed the handling, once you're indeed working on addressing the conflicts, addressing the violations to see how things are going. That's indeed one part of monitoring. Second is to avoid backsliding, so that an example, if a certain violation pops up again, that you can immediately detect it, take immediate action before the violation starts to pile up again. Third is to monitor the accepted risks. As I said, some conflicts you can just accept, but it's important to monitor them. And fourth, to refine SOD rules. And this is where the orange squares come into play. Once you have addressed all the conflicts that are occurring right now, you could focus on those orange squares and see whether those combinations that occur in practice, whether they are allowed or not. Because maybe you haven't thought of them in the beginning, but seeing them now, oh right, they aren't supposed to go together, so then you can indeed take action again and refine the SOD rules in that way. I know that I covered the 3 groups of risk factors already, but there's still a 4th section. Well, this is where we believe that it all comes together. This is the end goal, let's say. In the previous 3 sections, we used data, we used insights, we used data to gain insights to indeed tackle risky situations, such as addressing SOD violations, such as cleaning up orphaned accounts, which were mainly detective things. But it's important, we believe that it's important to use those insights, to use those rules, those controls that you defined, to automate as much as possible so that you can focus on what's really important and what's unknown. And that's adding the proactive part. So again, the key objective is to deal with known high-risk situations or the known low-risk situations automatically, so that you can focus on the unknown situations that require human intervention. It's combining the insights you get from the IAM KRIs, the role model, and the SOD roles together to automate IAM processes such as access requests and access reviews, and to indeed strengthen the policies. For access requests, for example, you could deny access requests automatically if they conflict with a restricted rule, something you defined at this should never happen, or it conflicts with an SOD rule, for example. But you could also automatically accept a request if it follows an allowed rule, like this is always allowed, this is no risk, just allow it. Or if it's a really low risk rule, like okay, there are no entitlements that are sensitive or so on, so you can assign this, but monitor those things indeed later on to see if things can get worse, of course. On the other hand, we see the policy part, where indeed, as we already discussed, you could integrate SOD rules in the role model so that SOD or conflicts actually, or toxic pairs, are not structurally assigned to your employees. You could also use role classification, so defining whether a role is high, medium, low risk, as a means to help to define privileged accounts. Maybe it's not the ultimate goal, but definitely one of the sub-ultimate goals of implementing a risk-based approach to identity and access management. Automating as much as possible so you can focus on the unknown situations, on the things that require your attention.